Hello and welcome to this new episode of Africafé. Today I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Marcus Vinicius de Freitas, who is Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. And today we're going to discuss the evolving dynamics of the transatlantic relations. Dear Marcus, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and to be with us today.
It's a pleasure to speak with you and your audience today.
Thank you so much. I want to go back to the historical foundations of the transatlantic relations and, of course, the relationship between the U.S. and Europe and how they evolved significantly over the past decades and how they shaped the future of transatlantic relations, especially with the chances that occurred with the rise of China's influence and also Russia as a growing regional power. How would you describe the first basis of these transatlantic relations?
I think that, if you go into history, both sides of the Atlantic are connected, right? You had colonization process from the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, all coming into the American continent and somehow, sharing this heritage. Now, it's an interesting thing because if you look into the borders of Africa, Europe, and, Latin America, and, even the American continent, we basically have four languages. So it's a very unified region when it comes to not having so much diversity when we talk, for instance, when we compare to Asia, where we have so many different alphabets, languages, and all that. So there is a historical connection between both sides of the Atlantic. If I look into Africa, we do have an enormous relationship due to the slave trade that there was in the past. That's the bad side of the history. But the positive side of that is that, we have inherited so much of African culture into all the Latin American countries, particularly Brazil, Venezuela, the Caribbean. So you see that influence there. And also in the United States, look into the legacy of African culture, for instance, in the American music and everything that we have seen. But of course, the transatlantic relation that we usually think about is everything that has taken place after the Second World War. And this enormous relationship that has been built between, particularly the United States and Europe, for security reasons, right? The fear of the Soviet Union, the fear of the Cold War, and all that. So those are things that we have seen as important elements. And if you think about the world after the Second World War, basically the whole rules-based order that we live in was set up by the transatlantic nations of, Europe, the United States, and the framework that we live in. So the relationship has been very important and very tense. Of course, as the years go by, we have seen changes in the whole international geopolitical scenario. If you look into the Cold War, it's no longer there. If you look into the Soviet Empire, it's no longer there. And we have seen, as you always say, transitions all the time. And, powers emerge and powers decline. And now we do see the emergence of China, which has been playing an important role, particularly in Africa, because, living in China, we realize that the Chinese recognize Africa as the last frontier when it comes to development and still things that need to be done. And somehow the Chinese have also looked into Latin America as an important place for providing many of the resources that they need for their economic development. So when we look into the transatlantic relations, we see that there have been moments of intense cooperation, particularly in the defense area, if you look at NATO and the importance of NATO. But over time, perhaps because of American isolationism that we have seen in certain occasions, or because of problems in the European Union, or even different agendas from both sides of the Atlantic, we have seen other players coming into the region and becoming more relevant.
Excellent. How do the changing ties between U.S. and Europe, China and Latin America impact the transatlantic relations in the global power structure right now?
What we do see is that if you look into the way the world was designed in 1944, we see that there is a preponderance of the what we call the global north, right? and you see that uh, influence affecting the World Bank, the IMF, the global governance that we have in the world. And of course, over the last few years, we have seen that the world is completely different from 1944. If you look into the number of African nations that we have now and what we had in 1944, uh, based on the principle of self-determination, what we have seen in Latin America happening over the last few decades, we realize that the world needs to change, right? Governance needs to reflect these new actors. And the problem, I think, and that's why I wrote the paper, is that the great challenge that we observe is that the countries in the north, in the global north, are not opening up ways for the global south to be more effective and participate in this new world order design that we have seen developing. So we have a new framework. Things have changed, and global governance needs to reflect this way. And that's why, China, in a way, has been very wise to always share this message of a shared future or shared values or shared destiny, while when you look into certain occasions in Europe or in the United States, you realize that there is a sense that these countries want to be more isolated and pay more attention to what is taking place internally. Even with the current election of President Donald Trump, you see that the motto of his campaign is America First. So it becomes a little bit more complicated for you to be talking about global governance when one of the main players is talking about itself, placing itself first. So I think that's why we understand that there are other options being offered in town, and these new countries, particularly China, when we look into that, or even the open space that we have for middle powers to be more effective in this scenario, we see that many things could change, and that will be also very important when we look into what we want the world to look like in the coming years. Is it going to be more inclusive or less inclusive? And what we realize is that if the transatlantic relations want to remain strong, we need to build a more inclusive global order.
Speaking about the making the transatlantic relations more strong and strengthened, what are the key specific sectors that southern countries should cooperate to make these relations much more stronger and actually? And I want to ask you also about how can we make Africa participate in the global governance in that sense?
They're very tough questions to ask and very important ones, right? Uh, we have to emphasize really the matters that get us closer, and we should not emphasize our differences. I think that many occasions we want to emphasize the asymmetries that you find between the continents, between the regions, between the countries. But we need to find what identifies us and what are the challenges that we face ahead. Certainly, one of the great concerns that we have is not only the issue of climate change, but the issue of environmental degradation that we observe on both sides of the Atlantic. So we need to deal with that, and that's an important issue for future generations. We also need to find better ways for improving the use of energy. You know, we are seeing the growth of electric cars around the world, and how this is going to affect the environment and how this is going to affect the wealth of the countries. Now, the most important thing I believe is that we need to find more ways to do more trade among ourselves. I think this is the number one priority, and somehow we need to open up the borders more intensively for trade and allow uh, exchanges between North and South, and particularly when it comes to technology, when it comes to people exchanges. So I think that somehow we have observed that uh, the discourse, political discourse against migration is a bad thing, because usually it's the global South that is on the negative end of the discourse on migration. And I think that the more interaction that we have between North and South, the better it is for the improvement of the South. I always say that the best policy against migration is making everybody rich, right? If everyone gets more money, you're not going to see many people trying to move from one country to the other. So I think those are areas where we need to cooperate more. Now, when it comes to African global governance, of course, you have Africa is one of the continents that has more countries than anyone else. And you have a rising population, young population. I think the projections is to have 2.5 billion Africans in the coming years. Majority, when you look into the average age of Africa, the population is very young. And I think that the world is facing this challenge of older population and younger population, and we need to find ways of synchronizing the interests. And of course, if we want the world to evolve and things to get better, we need to get Africa more involved so that we can also not take advantage, but we can use this new blood that Africa has to build a world system and a world order that is more equitable and more inclusive to everybody. So, in a way, I think that the world needs to look at Africa as the last frontier that we still have to do things right, to make things right, to improve the quality of life in Africa, and ensure that the youth that Africa has is really is capable of benefiting the world by its strength, its dedication, and the world is able to contribute to Africa in a way that lives will get better in the future.
Thank you so much, dear Freitas, for these valuable insights. Dear audience, thank you very much for following this episode and stay tuned for more episodes. Thank you very much.